The Bible Belt didn't rise because people proved it was true. It rose because nobody dared to question the story. A story about morality. A story about fear. A story about who belongs and who doesn't. And here's the part we rarely admit. Most of us didn't choose these beliefs. We inherited them, passed down like family land, guarded like sacred treasure, defended without ever opening the box. But what if the foundation of the Bible Belt isn't faith? What if it's repetition? And what happens when repetition finally meets doubt? Stay with me. Because once you see how this region was built, you'll never hear the word tradition the same way again. Faith as geography. We call it the Bible Belt, as if it is a natural landmark, like mountains, like rivers, as if it formed by accident, as if belief simply rose from the soil. But it is not geography, it is narrative density. Drive through parts of the South and you will see a church on every corner, sometimes two, sometimes three facing each other across the street, each with a different name but preaching the same certainty. White steeples, letterboards promising salvation, parking lots full every Sunday. And you think, this must mean something. So many buildings, so many people, so much agreement. But here is the quiet truth. Proximity does not equal proof. If you were born there, you did not encounter Christianity as an argument. You encountered it as atmosphere. It was in the accent of your teachers, in the prayers before football games, in the casual references to God during weather reports and political speeches. It surrounded you before you ever had the cognitive tools to evaluate it. When every voice around you echoes the same belief, it stops feeling like belief, it feels like reality. And reality does not ask to be defended, it simply is. That is the power of saturation. When an idea becomes unavoidable, it becomes invisible. You no longer notice it as a perspective. You experience it as the default setting of the world. Now imagine growing up without ever meeting a serious atheist, without hearing a pastor questioned publicly, without seeing doubt modeled as something thoughtful rather than rebellious. What would you conclude? Most people do not wake up one morning and choose faith after weighing evidence. They inherit a landscape where faith is already paved into the roads, built into the schools, woven into family identity. To reject it would feel less like changing an opinion and more like stepping outside the map entirely. And that is how belief transforms into territory. Not through conquest alone, but through normalization, so complete that questioning it feels like questioning gravity. But gravity has laws, so what were the forces that made this one so strong? The power of the revival tent. In the 18th and 19th centuries, traveling preachers moved from town to town, carrying more than Bibles. They carried urgency, they carried spectacle, they carried certainty in a world that felt unstable and raw. Revival tents would rise overnight in open fields. Lanterns glowing, voices echoing, entire communities gathering after long days of labor. There were no microphones, no polished stages, just a man with a voice strong enough to cut through the dark and a message sharp enough to pierce the conscience. And the message was not subtle. You are broken, God is watching, hell is real. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for philosophical nuance. Sin was personal, judgment was imminent, salvation was urgent, emotional, immediate. People wept. They confessed publicly. They fell to their knees in front of neighbors they had known their entire lives. The experience was not just intellectual persuasion, it was psychological immersion. Fear and hope intertwined so tightly that separating them felt impossible. Now consider the setting. Rural communities where survival depended on cooperation, where your reputation determined whether others would trade with you, help you harvest, or stand beside you in crisis. In that environment, you do not casually reject the belief system that binds everyone together. You conform, because doubt does not just threaten your soul, it threatens your standing, your relationships, your economic security, your identity within the group. When a preacher calls sinners to the front of a tent, he is not just offering redemption, he is defining belonging. Those who step forward are safe, those who hesitate are suspect. Faith became social glue. It held communities together through shared rituals, shared fears, shared promises of eternal reward. But glue does more than connect. It restricts movement. And once belief becomes the adhesive of society, questioning it feels less like curiosity and more like betrayal, not only of God, but of family, neighbors, and history itself. Over time, those emotional revivals did something lasting. They did not just convert individuals, they standardized expectation. They transformed intense moments into cultural norms. And that glue did not remain soft. It hardened into tradition, into law, into identity so solid that separating faith from community began to feel unthinkable. Faith as identity. In the Bible Belt, Christianity did not remain inside church walls. It stepped outside. It entered classrooms through morning prayers and carefully selected textbooks. It shaped political speeches and campaign promises. It hovered over family dinners where disagreement felt less like debate and more like defiance. It became identity. You were not simply someone who attended church. You were a Christian family, a Christian town, a Christian state. The label was not descriptive, it was defining. And with that shift came something subtle but powerful. You were not just a believer, you were a good person. Morality fused with membership. Here is the contradiction few people name out loud. When morality is monopolized by one story, disagreement quietly transforms into immorality. If goodness belongs to one narrative, then stepping outside that narrative feels like stepping outside goodness itself. That is how social pressure evolves into moral pressure. At first, it is small. A raised eyebrow when you skip church, a concerned comment about your questions, a reminder that faith anchors families. But over time, it deepens. Doubt is no longer treated as curiosity. It is framed as danger, not just to you, but to everyone around you. And moral pressure is harder to resist than social pressure. You can ignore gossip, you can survive criticism, but being told that your questions threaten your soul and the souls of others cuts deeper. Now you are not just wrong, you are sinful. The weight of that label changes behavior. People censor themselves before others have to. They learn which thoughts are safe and which are risky. They internalize the boundaries until self-policing replaces external enforcement. When faith becomes identity, questioning it feels like self-destruction. You are not revising a belief. You are dismantling who you are supposed to be. An identity built on fear always carries a hidden cost. It produces outward conformity, but inward tension. It protects the group, yet suppresses the individual. Eventually, that tension demands resolution. And when it does, the consequences ripple far beyond one person's private doubt. The fear we never named. Let us be honest for a moment. The Bible Belt is not sustained by devotion alone. It is sustained by a fear few people are willing to articulate clearly. Beneath the sermons about love and grace sits a deeper anxiety, the fear of chaos. The fear that without divine authority hovering above human behavior, everything fragile about society would fracture. That without Scripture as an anchor, people would drift into selfishness, violence, moral confusion. It is a powerful image, a world without God spiraling into disorder, families collapsing, crime rising, meaning evaporating. For generations, this fear was repeated often enough that it stopped sounding like speculation and started sounding like inevitability. So, religion became more than faith. It became a shield, a stabilizer, a moral security system protecting civilization from its worst instincts. But here is the paradox few dare to examine closely. If morality only exists under threat of punishment, what exactly are we defending? If a person refrains from harm because they fear hell, is that goodness or risk management? If kindness is performed under surveillance from an invisible authority, is it compassion or compliance? That question unsettles people because it shifts the foundation. It suggests that true morality might require freedom, that ethical behavior might be more meaningful when it is chosen without fear of cosmic consequences. And that idea threatens the shield itself. Because if humans are capable of goodness without divine enforcement, then the argument that society would collapse without religion weakens. The narrative that faith is the only barrier between order and chaos begins to crack. Foundations built on fear do not welcome inspection. They resist scrutiny because scrutiny exposes the scaffolding underneath. It forces a community to ask whether their stability comes from shared values or shared anxiety. And foundations do not like to be shaken, especially when entire identities rest on the belief that without them, everything falls apart. Stories passed down, not examined. Most believers did not read the Bible before they believed it. They absorbed it long before they analyzed it. The stories arrived early, wrapped in bedtime routines and Sunday school songs. They were told with warmth, with authority, with the quiet assumption that they did not require defense. From parents, from pastors, from cultural memory woven into holidays and rituals, the narratives were not introduced as hypotheses. They were introduced as history. Creation, the fall, the chosen nation, heaven and hell drawn in simple, vivid images that settled into the imagination before critical thinking had fully formed. When a story is repeated often enough, it begins to feel self-evident, not because it has been proven, but because it has never been seriously challenged. Familiarity creates a sense of inevitability. If everyone around you speaks as though something is obvious, you eventually stop asking whether it is. But repetition is not evidence. It is conditioning. Conditioning works quietly. It does not announce itself. It shapes emotional reactions first. Certain ideas feel comforting, others feel dangerous. Certain questions feel brave, others feel forbidden. Over time, those emotional cues become internal guardrails that guide belief without conscious effort. This is why so many people do not remember choosing faith. They remember growing into it the way they grew into their native language. It was already there, structuring reality before they could evaluate its grammar. And when belief is inherited this way, alternatives feel less like options and more like threats. Not because they have been disproven, but because they were never integrated into the mental map to begin with. Yet something changes when exposure expands, when new stories appear, when the once unchallenged narrative meets comparison. The invisible conditioning becomes visible. The unquestioned assumption becomes a subject of reflection. And that is where things begin to shift, not with rebellion, but with awareness. The cracks in the narrative. Access changes everything, not because it forces people to abandon belief, but because it removes isolation. For generations, entire regions could live inside a single dominant story with minimal exposure to alternatives. What felt universal was often local. What felt eternal was sometimes cultural. The internet did not march into the Bible Belt with a manifesto. It did something quieter and more disruptive. It introduced comparison. Suddenly, you could listen to a Muslim describe devotion that looked strikingly sincere. You could watch a Buddhist speak about compassion without reference to hell. You could hear an atheist explain morality in terms of empathy and reason rather than command. Different religions, different moral systems, different ways to build meaning, raise families, confront death. The shift was subtle at first. No dramatic confrontation, just exposure. Just the realization that billions of people live structured, ethical, loving lives outside the boundaries you were told were necessary. And when that realization sinks in, the phrase "only way" begins to feel less stable. Exclusivity thrives in isolation. It depends on limited alternatives. When alternatives multiply, certainty begins to thin. Not because faith collapses instantly, but because it must now compete rather than dominate. Here is what happens when exclusivity dissolves. Certainty becomes fragile. If goodness exists in multiple frameworks, then goodness may not belong to one story alone. If compassion emerges in cultures with different scriptures, then perhaps morality is not owned by any single tradition. That thought can feel threatening, not intellectually at first, but emotionally. It challenges inherited confidence. It introduces ambiguity where once there was clarity, and that realization does not feel freeing in the beginning. It feels destabilizing. Destabilization shakes identity. It unsettles families. It raises questions that cannot be easily answered in a sermon. And when a community feels destabilized, it often responds defensively. Because when narratives crack, the instinct is not always to explore the fracture. Sometimes it is to seal it shut before the doubt spreads further. When questioning feels like betrayal, leaving the narrative is rarely a purely intellectual decision. It is not a quiet moment at a desk where someone reviews arguments and calmly updates a conclusion. It is emotional. It is relational. It is deeply personal. Because belief in the Bible Belt is woven into family history. Church is where your parents married, where your grandparents are buried, where community milestones were marked and memories were formed. To question the belief system is not just to challenge an idea, it feels like challenging the people who trusted it. You risk disappointing parents who believe they raised you correctly. You risk losing friends whose lives revolve around shared faith practices. You risk becoming the one who drifted, the quiet cautionary tale mentioned in prayer requests. In tightly religious regions, doubt is not private. It shows up in attendance, in language, in subtle hesitations during conversations about God. People notice shifts quickly because belief is communal, not isolated. And that visibility creates silence. Questions are filtered before they are spoken. Curiosity is disguised as humor or swallowed entirely. Many individuals learn to perform certainty long after certainty has faded internally. This is the part statistics do not capture. Surveys can measure affiliation. They can count church attendance. They can track denominational shifts. But they cannot easily measure the number of people who remain outwardly aligned while inwardly uncertain. Many people do not stay because they are fully convinced. They stay because leaving carries consequences that feel heavier than doubt itself. Social belonging, family harmony, professional relationships, even romantic prospects can hinge on shared belief. When the cost of honesty feels too high, silence becomes survival. But silence does not eliminate tension, it stores it. Over time, internal questions accumulate, and when enough people quietly carry the same unspoken doubts, the surface stability begins to thin. Silence can endure for years. It can span generations, but it does not last forever. What happens when stories meet reality? Every generation inherits stories. They inherit them like heirlooms, already polished by time, already framed as sacred. These stories explain who we are, why we are here, and what happens when we fail. They offer comfort and structure before we are old enough to question their origins. But each generation also inherits something else: new information, new tools, new perspectives that previous generations did not have access to. Scientific literacy rises, exposure widens beyond regional borders. Moral frameworks evolve as societies confront issues earlier eras ignored or justified. Conversations about equality, psychology, trauma, and human rights grow more nuanced and more evidence-based. And slowly, a deeper shift begins. People start to notice that morality can exist without mythology, that empathy does not require eternal surveillance, that cooperation emerges naturally in social species because survival has always depended on it. Community can exist without dogma. Humans gather around shared interests, shared struggles, shared aspirations. They form bonds through vulnerability and mutual support, not only through shared creeds. Meaning can exist without fear. Purpose can arise from contribution, creativity, love, curiosity. It does not need to be anchored in threat to feel profound. This realization does not automatically erase tradition. Traditions carry history and identity. They shape culture in ways that cannot simply be dismissed. But their authority changes when they are seen as constructed rather than divinely fixed. Because once you see a story as a story, something fundamental shifts inside you. It no longer controls you invisibly. It becomes an object you can examine, interpret, reinterpret. You gain the power to edit it, to keep what resonates, to release what harms, to question what once felt untouchable. That is where real transformation begins. not in the destruction of every inherited belief, but in the freedom to engage with them consciously rather than unconsciously. The Bible Belt was not built by villains. It was built by repetition, by fear, by the deeply human need for certainty in a world that often feels unstable. It grew strong because its stories were rarely forced to compete. They were protected from scrutiny, reinforced by community, and treated as sacred long before they were examined. And when stories go unchallenged long enough, they do not just feel meaningful, they feel untouchable. But sacred is not the same as true. We are now living in a moment where inherited belief collides with open inquiry. Information moves faster. Comparisons are unavoidable. Questions surface that previous generations could afford to ignore. That tension feels uncomfortable, even threatening. Yet discomfort is not destruction, it is growth. It is the sound of foundations being tested. The real question is not whether the Bible Belt disappears. It is whether we finally examine the stories we were handed, instead of defending them by reflex. Freedom does not begin with rebellion. It begins with a question. If you value truth over comfort, keep questioning. And if this shifted your perspective, subscribe and do not stop thinking.